Today we're talking about power, and in particular, how to develop more power in your punches. Now, before we get into the tips for what you can do, we should get a few things out of the way that are not necessarily fully in your control. Genetics. Genetics is a thing, and it's a big deal in terms of how much power you can generate. It actually affects your athleticism in a whole bunch of ways that you might not even consider. But in relation to power, it can be either in terms of your build, the length of your limbs in comparison to your torso, and just the way your mechanics operate, which again, you can't help how long your arms are, how long your torso is, how dense your bones are. These things are built into your muscular makeup. So whether you've got that or not, that's not really in your control. You can't have an effect on that. The other thing, and there's a bit of a debate as to how much effect you can have on this, is your ratio of fast twitch to slow twitch muscle fibers. The argument's always been that you have a genetic component in terms of you have a determined amount of fast twitch fibers and slow twitch. Fast twitch being the ones that you would use for explosive, powerful movements. Think like a 100-meter sprinter full of fast twitch fibers, and slow twitch, which are more for endurance, long-term energy over a long duration of time. Think about a marathon runner, and that some people are genetically prone towards having more fast twitch and some are genetically prone towards having more slow twitch. Now, more studies have come out that have shown that you can have some level of impact on this, as in if you train for fast twitch, you can develop that, and if you train for low twitch, you can develop that as well. However, there's definitely going to be what your body kind of naturally strives towards. If you wonder kind of what makes a sprinter become a sprinter, what makes a marathon runner become a marathon runner, I can almost guarantee you that a marathon runner just naturally finds it easy to run for long distance. Before they even properly trained for it or got prepared for it, they just had a natural knack for covering long distance. The same way a sprinter was probably just very fast sprinting even without any training. Obviously not a world champion level, but let's say at school when they get onto the track and field and they do it for the first time, they just naturally win for no apparent reason. Genetics is definitely a part of the equation. In relation to punching power, there are just some people that have what's described as heavy hands. And if any of you have trained with someone like this, you'll realize it. There are certain people, they don't even have good technique. They haven't trained for very long. Their physique doesn't look particularly impressive. But when you hold pads for them or you spar with them, you just feel a level of power there that's kind of hard to describe. Now, in relation to this is physique. If we've got someone who is 180 pounds, we're just gonna take that as kind of a standard mid-range weight. That 180 pounds can be made up of two very different compositions. You can have someone who's extremely muscular, so they've got a low body fat percentage and the majority of the mass they're carrying is muscle. Or you can have someone who's got a lower muscle mass, but has got a much higher amount of fat that they're carrying around with them. Now, they both weigh the same, but in terms of how they're able to move and apply that weight, well, that becomes very different. The more muscle fibers you have, the more of that you can recruit into the movement. It's why the majority of professional fighters, with the exception of probably the heavyweight division, are generally going to be a very low body fat percentage and pretty high, relevant to their size, of muscle mass, because that's the useful stuff. Now, this isn't to say that some fat isn't useful, and the heavyweight division, where it's got the wide spread from 205 pounds up to 265, there's some scope for that where you can certainly make it work with a different type of body. But for the general majority of people, having more muscle on your frame and less fat is going to help you to generate more power. And whilst you might not think it, this does tie back to genetics, because again, some people are more genetically able to put on muscle mass. It's easier for them to grow like that, and other people find that extremely difficult. It doesn't mean you can't be powerful, and it doesn't mean you can't put on muscle mass. It just means you're gonna have to work that bit harder and your ceiling might not be as high. Okay, but beyond genetics and hitting the gym to get super hench, what can you actually do? What can you effectively start to implement to at least increase your relative power to your current size? The main thing, and if you only take one thing away from this video today, it is going to be technique. If you take two fighters where Everything else is equal. Same size, same build, they're identical twins. But one of them is just throwing a punch and the other one has been properly coached on the correct technique and is throwing it correctly. There's going to be a dramatic difference in the amount of power that they're able to develop. When we use the term good technique, when you see someone throw a punch and you go, that has good technique, what that really means is it's got good economy of motion. You're taking your hand from point A, which is where your guard is, to point B, which is where the target is, your opponent's face or body. And the technique is how economically do you travel through that space? How fast do you get there? Do you take any form of detour? And how effectively do you transfer the weight of your body through into the technique? Now, of course, each technique has its own movement mechanics. So the movement mechanics of throwing a jab are going to be different from the movement mechanics of throwing a lead arm hook. Same for the cross, same for the uppercut. We're not going to go through each punch's movement mechanics today, but that's something that you do want to start exploring. You want to make sure that you have a really firm understanding of what is the fundamental and correct way of throwing each punch. Now, if later on down the line you want to go and get a bit more unorthodox with it and explore other ways, that's absolutely fine, but I always encourage you to get a firm grasp on the fundamentals before you start exploring alternative ways of doing things. People have been throwing punches for a really, really long time, and we have over that time started to distinguish what is the correct way of doing it. What is the most economical and efficient way of taking your arm from point A to point B and generating the most amount of power? In the majority of cases, that power is going to come from some form of pivoting or rotation through the torso. Remember, when we're punching, we're not really hitting with our arm. And what I mean by that is, it's not my arm that generates all the force. My arm is a vehicle for transporting my weight through the punch. So really, the way we generate more power is we put more of our body weight in behind the technique. I don't mean wild swinging. What I mean is, how can I rotate or pivot and create all the force and then direct that through my arm, down my fist, and onto my opponent? So a real key area of that technique that you're going to be working on is going to be on that pivot and rotation. It's why they say that all punches start from the ground, because although we're thinking about the fist landing on the target, we really need to be thinking about how do our feet rotate, which is going to rotate our knees, which is going to rotate our hips, which is going to rotate our torso, our shoulder, and that's what's going to take the punch to the target. Get a good coach, get a camera, get a mirror, find a way of starting to look at your technique and really break it down and look at how you can improve it. My second tip is going to be to use a heavy bag. Now, I didn't have access to one to film some B-roll for this one, but what I really mean is a very heavy hanging bag. I use the freestanding bag because it's just the convenience of moving it around my training space and for filming videos for you guys. But ideal situation, if we're really trying to work on developing our power, is a bag that's heavier than us. A bag that when you hit it, it barely even moves, and you really got to hit it correctly to get any form of swing going. A heavy bag won't lie to you. It's not going to move, and it is going to hurt you if you don't punch it correctly. So it helps to keep your technique honest, and it helps you to really work on your conditioning, because every punch you throw is going to be met with a large amount of resistance. Now, I'm not going to pretend to understand all of the science today, and I'm not going to try to pretend to explain it to you guys, but what I will say from my own personal experience, both in my training and my coaching, is that those that are able to work on a heavy bag regularly generate a lot more power with their punches. The last thing is going to be exercise. And what I'm not saying here is so much the weightlifting that we talked about earlier in terms of trying to build body mass. What I really mean is working explosive movements that's going to support your punching power. Plyometrics should be a regular part of your strength and conditioning sessions. And for any of you that aren't aware of what that is, plyometrics are basically explosive movements. So a very simple example would be a squat jump. You squat down as low as you can to the ground, and instead of just coming back up at the same tempo, you explode up and jump into the air. generally speaking, plyometrics do involve one of your limbs or some part of your body coming up off the floor. Not always, but in general, they are jumping forms of movement that force you to explode from a deep down in motion. In terms of how we can relate that back to our punches, take for example our basic press-ups. If you're doing martial arts, undoubtedly you're doing some form of push-ups. Now, if you do the regular push-ups, that's great, overall strength, good conditioning, good for your shoulders, but explosive press-ups, or sometimes you'll see people doing clapping press-ups, all of these are variations on the same theme. They involve you going down with control and then exploding up out of the motion against the resistance of your body weight and of course gravity. But it's not just the upper body. Like we said, punches start from the floor, so you need to have strong explosive legs, hips and core. So things like squat jumps or jumping lunges or anything that's got a rotational movement like a medicine ball slam against the wall, all of these are going to really help to translate your athleticism into generating more power with your punches. There we have it, guys. Work on your technique, get on that heavy bag and implement some plyometric work into your training. If this video has been helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. We've got new videos coming out every week and I will see you on the next one.